Hey guys, welcome to another ride of the Struggle Bus, where every wheel is an empty triangle. On today's Struggle Bus Beyond the Basics video, we're going to be talking about all things cuts. And many of you who've been paying attention will think, hey, that's already on the list of the Struggle Bus Basic rules. And that is true, but we don't actually yet have a video for it, which is kind of shameful, but here we are to rectify that situation. Also, there's going to be some stuff that we go over here that's kind of a little beyond the basics, and so I think this one could kind of fall into either category, but we are putting it into beyond the basics because we are going to get some rules from it that can fall onto that list. But either way, we need to start at the beginning and talk about cuts in general. And so looking at the board that we have in front of us, we can jump right in. We just have a sample of a few shapes that we typically see in our games. And we want to take a look at them and go over, what cuts are and why they're important and why we care about them. So when I'm defining a cut, I'm talking about when we have two stones or two groups that are not yet connected and our opponent can play in a way that separates those two stones or groups. That is what we define as a cut. So if we just looked at two stones like this, there's no way that these two stones can be cut because they are already connected. But all the other shapes on the board are shapes that can get cut sometimes. So taking a look at it, let's start. We're just going to start the top left and go down. We've got the one space extension. So here, this is typically considered a fairly safe shape in terms of cuts, but it can still be cut. If white plays the wedge and black goes to Atari and white extends, black can connect here, but then white can take the cut, or conversely, black can connect here and then white takes the cut. So even though this is a pretty safe shape, it is important to know that it can be cut. And in this situation, as along with pretty much all the other cuts, it's going to depend highly on what the surrounding stones look like. If black has more support here, then this cut isn't going to be too detrimental. And that's something we're going to get into later in the group. I just wanted to show the cuttable shapes here. So the next shape up is the knight's move, or the kema. And it is important to know that this shape pretty much can always be cut. Though it is going to depend, again, on the surrounding stones, because when we do cut, there's going to be a ladder that gets set up. So here we could have a ladder that runs this way, or if white looks to cut here, there's a ladder that runs this way. But it is important to know that if either of those ladders are good for your opponent, they can choose which way to cut and force a ladder in that direction. So in this situation, we do end up getting cut if this ladder does not work. So this is a shape we need to be mindful of if we are caring about being connected. Next shape up is the two space extension. And just, this is, in terms of being connected, is clearly worse than the one space extension. So it's going to be no surprise that this shape can be cut. And again, it's going to depend on the outside stones because we're going to have a ladder. But again, depending on what way white cuts, depends on the direction of that ladder. So we need to consider that when we are playing the two space. Next up is probably the strongest shape that we have on this board. If white is looking to cut, white would start here and then take this. It is worth noting that white can only cut in one direction here. And while doing so, there's a ladder. So this is the only ladder that matters. And if this ladder is good for black, then this shape cannot be cut. If this ladder is good for white, there are still plenty of opportunities for black to smother these stones and or change direction and go after this stone, depending on the outside groups. And then our final shape is the large knight's move. And this is probably the most notorious of them all because there's so many ways to cut this. White could just immediately go here. White could extend one more time and then take the cut. White can play here and then take the cut. There's lots of options, and again, this is going to depend on the status of the ladders, but white has many ways to cut this root. And so in our games, it's often very important to stay connected because if our groups stay connected, we stay strong. And if we're able to split our opponent's groups, we can then go harass them later in the game and get profit while doing so. So that's just a quick primer on what cuts are. And we're going to have some examples of these shapes in games, showing why they're important, and then going over some good rules with cuts. So let's get into those examples. So the first example we have here is from a recent teaching game that I did, where going into it, I wanted to focus a lot on cuts. And so I created a lot of situations as white in this game to challenge the student on analyzing cuts. And that's really the big rule here, is that we should always be assessing cuts because they're going to show up in our games no matter what. The big important thing to consider is whenever you play a shape that can be cut, you need to have a plan for if you do get cut. And if you do not have a plan for that cut, then you shouldn't be playing that shape. So in this case, black played J15. And so with black playing this, this knight's move, it can very easily be cut. And I'm sure black was aware of this. So black needs to have a plan for what to do with this cut. If black does not have a plan for this cut, then black really needs to reconsider this move and maybe just jump out or play the diagonal. This is a shape that cannot be cut. And as mentioned before, this is a bit of a safer shape, especially when we have strength here. But playing this, you need to have a plan. So if you play moves like this and you don't have a plan for how you're going to handle this cut, these are the types of cuts that you need to be assessing a little more. I've done plenty of teaching games and game reviews where I asked the player in a situation like this, even if the cut didn't happen, I would ask, what was your plan if your opponent cut here? And I would often get the response that they didn't really have a plan. And that's never a good answer. So in this situation, my student played J15. I did cut. They extended, and then I extended, and then black tanuki'd here, which kind of tells me that they didn't really have a good plan for the cut, because now these two stones can very easily be attacked. And that's what ended up happening. I pressured the left while looking to go after these two stones. So here, my student didn't have a good plan for this cut. And so in that case, it would have been better to have not played a shape that can be cut. So again, either the diagonal or one point jump, or even the attachment here. So that's what we mean when we say to always be assessing cuts. And that's both for your cuts and your opponent's cuts. Whenever a cut shows up on the board, you need to be figuring out, is this a cut that needs to be protected or one that can be exploited, right? If it's one of your cuts, you need to figure out if it needs to be protected or not. Because not every cut needs to be protected. Sometimes we can endure the cut because we've got surrounding groups that are strong enough to handle that. But it is up to you to figure that out. So the next example from this game comes immediately, where we took this cut when black tanuki'd, we leaned on the group here. And we have the same shape. We've got this knight's move, and we know that this can be cut. So if black plays here and cuts, white needs to have a plan. If white does not have a plan for this, then white cannot play d14. Fortunately, I did have a plan for this. I knew that this cut was available. I had taken a look and saw that if I played d13, that things should be okay here. There's lots of ways this could go, but it is worth noting that right here, black's shape is also cuttable, right? The two-space extension also has cuts there. So I know that there's weaknesses in black shapes as well. And so I was able to take a look at this and determines that this is a cut that I could handle. And if I couldn't handle this cut, again, I shouldn't be playing d14. I should be playing something like e14, which is easier to handle, because in this situation, this is not a cut that I'm worried about. But fortunately, I was able to take a look, and this is also not a cut that I was worried about, because I knew that I could get ahead of black and either cut to the left or cut into the center. So this is an example of assessing a cut and determining that it's fine, we don't need to protect it, we can endure that cut. the next example in this game comes immediately after this one. Like I said, there were a lot of cuts in this game, which is why this was the game that I chose for all the examples. Here, black plays this stone, which can easily be cut here as well as here. So in this situation, black needs to have a plan. What is black's plan if white plays here? If black doesn't have a plan for this, then black cannot play this stone. And just giving up the stone really isn't the best plan, which is what ended up happening in the game. It's possible that black could have gone this way and looked to give up these two stones while getting some strength in the center. If black had played this way, I at least would have been okay with it because it's clear that black had a plan. Unfortunately, that is not the way that black went. And so here we were able to take advantage of the cuts. So as you can see here, we can get in a lot of trouble if we don't respect the cuts that are on the board. And this is a very common way to lose games, is by not realizing how difficult a cut would be to handle and how detrimental it would be to our groups or the shape or our territories. And again, we should be looking at these when our opponents make the mistakes as well. So let's take a look at two more examples in this game where I leave the cut and see what that looks like. So not too long after the exchanges at the top, I end up playing N5 at the bottom of the board. And this is one of the shapes that we pointed out early in the video. And we know that this shape can be cut, though it is one of the stronger shapes. But the method to cut this is typically to play here. And when white goes here, we cut. And in this situation, the ladder does not work for white. So black is safe here. And this doesn't look very good for white. I am unsure how white's going to get out of this. So this is another example where white really didn't have a good plan for this cut. And so white probably should not have played this move. White could have considered playing a little closer if the cut was a concern. But in this case, that is not where white played. And so this is an example of where your opponent plays the cut and you need to take a look at it. So there's one more example with this game that I want to show that is similar to this one. So let's take a look at that now. So here we are a little bit later in the game. Black has played here looking to surround these stones. And I decided to play here to try to link up. But we notice the shape that I played here, and we know that this can be cut. And so the question is, what was my plan for this cut? If black had played here and taken this cut, do we have a good plan? And the answer is no. This looks very bad for white. So this was another opportunity for black to assess the cuts and determine if it was worth going after. And in this case, it is. So again, when we're playing these shapes, we need to be very mindful that we are leaving these cuts behind, and we need to make sure that we have a plan when we are making these cuts. And if you don't have a plan, then you need to play a safer shape. And so that is why we have the rule to always be assessing cuts. But with all that said, cuts are just a part of the game. They are going to happen. There's really no way to avoid it. So it's important to understand some basic rules involving cuts. So let's get into those now. So this example was also taken from a recent teaching game. And don't worry, there's only one example in this game, but it's a very important one. And it highlights our next rule. And our next rule is no random peeps. So to define what a peep is a move that we play that is directly next to a cut that threatens to take the cut. So an example here is if black plays this move. This is peeping the cut at M5. If white plays away and plays something like this, then we can follow through and take the cut. So this is what we call a peep. And often what happens is players learn of this new skill, these peeps that they can play that are forced moves. They get to play them and your opponent responds to them. So that's fantastic. And then they just play them all over the place. But playing bad peeps can get you in trouble, or not so much get you in trouble, but it can get your opponent out of trouble. So taking a look at this with white playing here, we recognize a very cuttable shape here. We know that this shape can be cut. But if we play a bad peep like this, what happens is, yes, this is a forcing move, but it forces white to fix the shape. And then when we play the next bad peep, it forces white to fully fix the shape. So now that cut is no longer there. Black had an opportunity to take this cut, but instead played bad peeps, thinking that they were getting something good out of this exchange, when in actuality, it's just forcing white to get stronger, and white is very happy to be playing these moves. So just like when cuts show up and we need to make sure we have a plan for them, you need to really make sure that your peeps are getting you something more than your opponent is getting, because often they come with the downside of your opponent fixing their shape. And so if you're letting your opponent fix their shape for free, you're losing out on that deal. You need to make sure that you're getting more out of the exchange than your opponent is. And if you don't know if you are or aren't, do not take that peep. So that is why the next rule is no random peeps. And again, the reason we don't want to do that is there was a cut here. Even after this initial peep was done, there's still a cut here. Black can play here. White can Atari. Black connects. And if white connects here, black takes the cut. And if white connects here, black takes the cut. So there was a cut here. A very powerful looking cut. But instead, if black takes this peep and white gets to connect, then that cut disappears and white is very happy. The next rule that we have dealing with cuts is a little nuanced, but it is worth pointing out. And so that is what our next example shows.
Okay, so here we have our next rule and next example for that rule. And this one is that if you're going to push, you have to cut. And if you're not going to cut, then you shouldn't push. And what I mean by that is, as white right here, there is a cut that we can take. We can push, and then we can take this cut. Or we can take this cut. But we cannot do this push unless we plan on immediately taking the cut. If you don't plan on taking the cut, then don't play this move. And one of the main reasons that we don't want to do that is often we lose liberties. If you take a look at this white stone currently has 3 liberties. But if we are then going to push and not cut, now we only have 2 liberties. So we've actually lost a liberty on this exchange. And sometimes that liberty really, really matters. So let's take a look at white trying to live here. White could push, black could block, white will extend, black will hane, white will hane, and then black would want to double hane here if black can get away with it. But now white can play here, take this Atari, black can take this Atari to try to kill, and, but then it doesn't work. White gets to capture the stone. But what would have happened if we had pushed and not cut and tried this same exchange? So let's, for example, say that we push, and then we extend. And then black extends. We extend, black hanes, we hane, black double hanes. We now take the Atari. We take this Atari, black gets this Atari, we capture, and now black plays here. And the fact that we don't have that liberty means we completely lose this fight. And this can happen a lot. So it is important that if you are not going to take the cut, you cannot play this move. I'm not saying don't play this move, but if you do, you have to take the cut. If you don't plan on taking the cut, just plan on what your follow-up was going to be. Very important rule. So let's get on to the next rule and example that deals with cuts.
So here we have a very simple board to show the next rule. And that rule is if your opponent attaches to one of your stones, you should respond to it, especially if they are attaching to a weak stone. So in this situation, white has some options. White can play one of the 2 extensions or one of the 2 hanes. And which of these 4 moves is the right move depends on the situation, just like anything else. But these are really the only options that we should be considering here. We should be considering either extending or playing the hane. So that is the next rule. If you get attached to, you need to respond to that. So in this case, we could extend or we could hane in either of the 2 directions, but we have to do one of those 4 moves. And then, of course, the rest of the board is going to dictate which one is better. If you are ever unsure of which one is better, extending is always going to be safer. And the reason extending is always going to be safer is when we hane, it leaves behind a cut. And so the cut is going to complicate things. Sometimes we can handle this cut. And if we can handle this cut, then the hane is stronger. But if you don't want to deal with that cut, you can always just extend. So extending will always be safer, but sometimes the Hane is stronger. And so our final rule will pivot off of this and will help highlight why this rule exists. So let's go talk a little bit about crosscut fights. So our final two rules involve what are called crosscut fights. So in this situation, black has played this shape, which we know is a cuttable shape. So in this situation, white can push and cut. And again, we know from a previous rule that we cannot push if we do not plan on immediately cutting. So in this situation, if white is not going to take this cut, I would expect white to at least extend. But I would not like to see white play this and then extend. If we are going to push, we have to cut. But in this case, that is what white wants to do. And so in this situation, we have what is called a cross-cut fight. Because when you cut your opponent, you are also cutting yourself. So in this situation, there are four groups that we need to care about. We've got the A and B group for black, and we've got the C and D group for white. So there are two important things to know about crosscut fights. And the first one is you need to identify which of your groups is weakest and which of your opponent's groups is weakest. You then want to play a move that makes your weakest group stronger and or your opponent's weakest group weaker. And that is almost always going to be extending off of your weakest group. So in this case, black identifies that B is their weakest group and that C is white's weakest group. So black is going to play a move that makes B stronger and or makes C weaker. So in this case, I would expect black to extend here. And then it is white's turn to identify which of their groups is weaker and which of black's groups is weaker. In this case, it doesn't really matter too much which of black's groups is weaker. They're both, they're both similarly strong and weak as each other, but it's very obvious that that white's K12 stone is the weakest one. So white should be extending off of this as well, either with the extension this way, the extension this way, or potentially even the diagonal, something to make this group stronger. And then the fight is going to continue on, and it's going to be complicated, but it's going to be much better for you if you recognize that you're making your weakest groups stronger. The other rule for crosscut fights is you do not want to Atari the cutting stone. This one's really important. And the reason is if you Atari the cutting stone, so C is the cutting stone here, if black were to play this, what happens is it forces white to make their weakest group stronger. And that's what white wanted to do anyway. So now black is forcing white to make their group stronger. And because it's all things cuts, it leaves behind a cut at L11. And so now black feels obligated to fix this cut. So before this crosscut started, the C stone only had 2 liberties, and the B stone had 2 liberties. After this exchange, before black fixes this, the B stone still only has 2 liberties, but white's group now has 3 liberties. So white gained a liberty and black gained a cut. So this is obviously a bad result for black, which is why we typically do not Atari the cutting stones. And so circling back to this example where we attach to the stone, one of the big reasons you want to respond to this attachment is because if a cross-cut fight is going to happen, you really want the first move. You really want to be able to have 3 stones versus 2 stones. If you don't respond to this and play away and your opponent takes the Hane and then we cross-cut, now your opponent is the first one to get the move starting the cross-cut fight, and so they'll be more advantaged. So that is the main reason why when we get attached to, we want to respond to that. So that is your primer on all things cuts. They're certainly much more complicated than this video goes into, but this shows us the basics and some do's and don'ts in terms of cuts that you can employ in your games to get a little stronger. And again, those main rules are to assess our cuts, no random peeps, and responds to when our stones get attached to. So anyway, thank you guys for coming out for another ride in Struggle Bus Square. Every wheel is an empty triangle. Have a good one, guys.